Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Started with some introductions here. Hello everyone and welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this moment. I am Raven, a host here at the Stoa. So basically what we're going to do is Johannes is going to have the floor for about 20 minutes here, and then we will open up to questions from the audience. Johannes is a philosopher in the wild, bringing the ancient tradition of philosophy, keeping the ancient tradition of philosophy alive, asking real questions about what is the meaning of life, what is the meaning of death and being. He is the founder of the Halcyon Thinkers Guild and currently teaching a course called Idleness with Dignity. Today, he will be discussing leisure as the basis for the coming Renaissance. And with that, I bring you Johannes.
Thank you very much, Raven. Thank you very much, Peter, for inviting me. The talk is on leisure, on skole in the Greek sense. I'll do something a bit old-fashioned. I'll read and give a proper lecture, which means to read, and then we'll take questions. So, the question of leisure is not a question of what we do when we have some free time from work. Rather, it is the question of all questions, the question of skole, true leisure, muse, as the German vernacular says, is the question that founds civilization. It is the basis of civilization. Athens was born, Plato tells us in his dialogue Critias, on the basis of skole, when skole arrived in the midst of Athenians. For then their thoughts had turned towards the plenty, the abundance of beings, and of course also to an appreciation of the old and their ancestors. But this, our age, as Goethe bemoans in his Maximes and Reflections, is unholy, since nothing is allowed to come into its own, which means nothing is allowed to ripen. A great forgetting set in centuries ago, and the reckoning now has come. We have forgotten who we are, who we yet do not remember who we have always been. Goethe here continues, the activity of commerce, the rush and rustle of paper money, the swelling up of debts to pay debts, all these are the monstrous elements to which in these days a young man is exposed. What is debt other than the utter abyss which sucks us empty and leaves our world voided of meaning? Usury is an existential trap, a tempocidal destruction of all genuine access to time and history, the freezing of our memory of who we are and have always been. What Goethe begins to see here already is what Heidegger will come to call the insatiable will to will, that wills evermore and can only give itself a ground if it continues to will more and ever greater costs for all, and ever more force and greater effort, and ever smaller dividends and yields. A tiredness has ruled us for long already, if we are honest to ourselves. A sluggish tiredness that masquerades as positive thinking, immediately prescribed optimism, keeping calm and carrying on, hiding our frail nerves and portraying ourselves as strong-willed and forceful and competitive, but caving immediately when the subtle uncanniness of existence begins to spit at the empty-go-lucky, happy-go-lucky attitude that we are forced to display. We live not in a polis that is a mirror of the good order of the cosmos. We do not live in a virtuous polis of fellow humans who cooperate, but in an uncanny real work, as Nietzsche calls it. We exist in the grind of the, quote from Nietzsche, total economic management of the earth. But earth has begun to fight back. How sick and corrupt and anti-human is a system that collapses if the world stands still for only 2 weeks. Who and what are these concealed gods many pray to and sacrifice for unbeknownst to them. Is this a world fit for humans where stillness is a sin? What we have forgotten is what the Greeks called skole, leisure, or Muße in German, which is not free time from work, but which we are sometimes granted, and granted if and only if all basic needs are met. No, as anyone who can see what drives this planetary uncanny wheel work, the will to will that wills itself and wills itself so. Why? Just because it is so. Anyone who sees this knows that never will all needs be met, for the will itself is lack, fundamental lack. Leisure does not come once all basic needs and wants and desires are met. Instead, leisure itself is the cradle of civilization, of the well-ordered polis. The planet has ground to a halt. Atlantis is sinking again. Plato tells us in his dialogue Critias that Atlantis, this most magnificent city of its time, began to lose its ways when the Atlanteans directed their sense towards lack. And the continuous inflow of goods to still their insatiable appetites became dominant. Their harbor, the harbor of Atlantis, never stood still. They turned their days into a restless frenzy and their nights into days. An uncanny wheelwork indeed. In the same dialogue, Plato tells us how Athens became Athens, the polis of the goddess Athene, the garden of the fruits of which we still enjoy. Athenians, before they became who they were, directed their sense toward lack. They had no room for a knowledge of the old, of that which has always been. They found no stance to take in the midst of beings. And skole was nowhere to be found. Just very briefly, skole, the word in Greek, comes from echein, which means to have, to hold. So skole literally is that which grants hold, a stance in the midst of beings. But once the Athenians directed their sense towards skole, they were to remember towards the stance in the midst of beings. They began to remember their future. They were able to remember who they had always been. Skole, the spirit of true leisure, entered them, arrived in their midst, and they found the hold to ground the polis that became Athens, the true garden. With their sense directed at skole, their spirit filled with it, Athenians turned to what Plato calls mythology, the knowledge of the old, of their ancestors. The old, as Aristotle tells us, is the name for being, toti en enai, that which has always been being. The question of being, which we are forgetting, is a reminder of who we have always been. But the will to will blinds our eyes and hearts for this deep memory and true innering, memorizing, coming to our senses, bringing into the inner of our hearts of who we are. The will to will wills us to be enslaved by debt, numb from experience and death machines. The will to will wills us to kill time rather than allowing for the wonders of boredom to disclose to us the wonders of the world and who we are. For it is in our epoch, through the horror vacui also, and the horror of emptiness, that meaning can begin to shine forth. Directing our senses again to skole, the spirit of true leisure, will take hold of us and remind us of our ancestors, of the old, of being. It is then that we can begin again to build proper cities, houses fit for humans, an oikonomia, an economy, the nomos of the house, that's what this means, the law of the house, that does not destroy the earth, does not deplete meaning, and does not use usury. It is then that we could begin again to dwell. And as Heidegger points out, genuine dwelling means to protect the earth, but does not mean to destroy the earth in search for the insatiable lust for comfort, or to use the earth as a gas station. But we must begin again to think first. And of course, now, currently, an obscene haste rules, more than perhaps before the corona pandemic. And this obscene haste I see in wanting to act, wanting to find a cure, wanting to establish a new order of the world. And as we saw with an essay that went around this week, which was "It's time to build" in all capital letters. But what the essay argued for was to have more stuff. If only we had, in hindsight, more stuff, we would have been saved. But thinking is what we have to do first. Contemplate, perhaps also. We must think. If we still are the zoon logon echon, the living being that finds itself and holds itself in logos. We must gather ourselves to come to our senses to the genuine human sense, which is the sense of that Goethe still speaks of and still remembers. And Goethe remembers also that all that is intelligent has already been thought. What we are to do is think again through the echoes of truth. And suddenly we are thrown back to ourselves, looking for a stance, for something to hold on to. We will not find it in an obscene haste. We might find a stance again if we begin to be idle with dignity, which is to say that we find our being human, what it means to be human, only in this being suspended in the proper need to ground ourselves. I would like to read a passage from Nietzsche's Gay Science, which is entitled Muße und Müßiggang, Leisure and Idleness. The Gay Science is the book which is already pregnant with Zarathustra, the prophet of the eternal recurrence, and also of the recurrence of the tragic sense. This is Nietzsche. The breathless haste of America with which they work is already beginning to infect old Europe with its ferocity and is spreading a lack of spirituality, Geistlosigkeit, like a blanket. Even now, one is ashamed of resting, and prolonged reflection almost gives people a bad conscience. One thinks with a watch in one's hand, even as one eats one's lunch, while reading the latest news of the stock market. One lives as if one always might miss out on something. Rather do anything than nothing. This principle, too, is merely a string to throttle all culture and good taste. Just as all forms are visibly perishing by the haste of the workers, the feeling for form itself, the ear and eye for the melody of movements are also perishing. The proof of this may be found in the universal demand for gross obviousness, in all those situations in which human beings wish to be honest with one another for once in their associations with friends, women, relatives, children, teachers, pupils, leaders, and princes. One no longer has time or energy for ceremonies, for being obliging in an indirect way, for esprit in conversation, and for any otium at all. End of quote. So without leisure, without idleness, we are spiritless, we are numb. There is no poetry in such a world. All enjoyment is already only relaxation, as if we were an ox under a yoke, a castrated animal carrying a burden it does not see. The question of leisure and idleness, make no mistake, is not some question about what we do in our spare time or now that we are locked in. This is not to say true leisure just means to read some Aristotle either, or that we have some, now that we have some time to ourselves. No, the question of Skole properly and directly concerns itself with the question what it means to be human. To enter into the spirit of true Skole or true leisure means to begin to remember a future we have never known. In 1949, the German Catholic philosopher Joseph Pieper published an essay entitled Muße und Kult, which is usually translated as leisure at the basis of culture. There's something lost in this translation. Muße is Skole, the true spirit of foundational leisure. But kult does not mean culture, it means worship. Without the divine, we are only ever idolizing ourselves in a fake leisure. True ceremony is only possible with a view to the divine and with sacrifice. And only then with sacrifice can we also safeguard the earth. In his essay, Pieper reminds his readers of the grand tradition of the Occident, the land of dusk, of its contemplative caste, which once was, of those who by meditating and contemplating looked after that which is. Pieper fears that we all would become workers in a world of total work. He reminds his readers that those who pray to God before bedtime sleep better. But he also says that it would be absurd to assume that someone just prays in order to sleep better, in order to increase efficiency or effectivity of sleep, as if praying were but self-idolatry of the human being. Little did he know that Meditation Inc., in all its various disguises, a few decades after his death in the late 90s, would offer just this mad thing that we now meditate in order to sleep better. But what does it mean to meditate? One of the oldest sentences of Occidental wisdom comes from Periander, which is in Greek, meleta tanpan. Take into care and consideration everything that is, beings in the whole. To meditate means to care for beings deeply and profoundly. Meditating in order to perform better at whatever task, or to get over anxiety, for example, is avoiding and desertification of the meaning of meditation, and hence one of the pale horses on which nihilism has pillaged our lands and pastures. Let us begin, rather, to direct our sense, or Menschensinn, our sense of being human, towards the spirit of true leisure, the plenty and fullness at the heart of things, the exuberance of being, the gift that is thinking itself. For then we begin to remember what we have always already been, and we build towards a genuine future and not some fantasy. Our economic systems, whatever ism they are all predicated on fundamental lack. Yes, humans, I agree, have needs, very obviously. This is undeniably true. However, the needs with which we are concerned in our economic systems and our political systems too are ever only the most immediate, and they're only material needs. We only ever consider the useful. Is not meaning, sense, our most fundamental need. But for the economic and political systems that we know today, meaning has no place. How can we redirect then our human sense? Perhaps by taking again the meditative stance of leisure, and by moving beyond utilitarian calculations. Consider Heidegger's interpretation of Zhuangzi's The Useless Tree. The tree no longer bears any fruit, and hence the peasant who owns the tree wants to cut it down. But Zhuangzi invites the peasant to begin to see something else, another possibility, another dimension even, for the tree. The tree is useless, yes. Nothing can be made of it. Still, the tree, precisely for its uselessness, invites us to sit underneath it, simply in order to sit, and so to come to our senses again. This is similar for the meaning of things. One cannot do anything with meaning. Meaning is profoundly useless for the uncanny calculations of the wheelwork. In fact, one could even go as far as saying that the uncanny machinery requires meaninglessness for its operations. The useless is that which is beyond utilitarian calculations and hence withdraws from them. Yet, thanks to this withdrawal, other dimensions of meaning occur and open up in which the instrumental and the utilitarian have no place. True leisure itself is useless for the operations of the will to will. But as such, true leisure is the source of meaning, for that which is useless is untouchable and enduring. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johannes. So now we're going to move into the question and answer period. So if you would like to put your question in the chat, and I will then call your name and you can unmute yourself and ask your question directly to Johannes. And I'm just going to start by asking a few questions for you. So as I'm listening to what you're saying, and I've been also taking in some of your other lectures, it seems like the integration or the idea of idleness, coming at it from our cultural perspective now, is actually a massive challenge. Because I can imagine moving from this idea of like, oh, instead of working, I'll be idle, but it'll be because I want to be more productive or because I want to sleep better. And I was thinking about how sleep actually might be a way for the Western human to kind of get into this idea of idleness. What would you have to say about sleep and idleness?
It's yeah, the way we think of sleep is that we need our 8 hours of sleep in order to be productive the next day. And I just saw today, actually, this is an advice for anyone who's here to sign up to Tom Hodgkin's newsletter. He's just a fascinating, eccentric Brit anyway, so he's just fun to listen to. But Tom said today, bosses are getting worried because it actually is now, it's now possible to work from home, etc. But sleep is crucial. And actually there is in the Occident, or in the Western cradle, there are examples of the appreciation of sleep for a completely different reason than we now think of it, and that's in Heraclitus. And Joseph Pieper mentions this actually in his essay on leisure as the basis of culture. The Heraclitus says that those who sleep participate in the world, that they're not cut off from the world, and they participate in it, not in the sense of how we would probably see it. You sleep your 8-9 hours and then you're productive again the next day. No, it's so foreign to us to say this, right? Someone who sleeps just by sleeping, the official English translation is participates in the business of the world, participates then in what happens. And this is someone like Andrew Taggart, for example, who mostly at this point meditates and says when he meditates, the philosophical questions just come to him from meditating. Mm-hmm. This is it's unusual now for us to think of, for example, a priest caste, which what they do is they think, or they meditate, or they pray, and in so doing, they co-enlighten the world, right? And it's completely non-productive. It's completely non-utilitarian. It can't be measured. It can't be qualified. It cannot be evaluated. And yes, so the way one can begin to think about sleep is not that it makes you in any sense, it's there to make you more productive or anything, but it's that in sleep something foundational happens, which is that it brings you in tune with beings, speaking this Heideggerian way, or with the world in a way that being awake doesn't. Mm-hmm. So we have to take it seriously and on that level too, but that there's something that dreams tell us about us and about the world.
Yeah, and so another thing I was wondering about is there's this idea that we will get to idleness through automation, through these like structures. I mean, there's this idea going around of like fully automated luxury capitalism as the patch of the future that's going to release us from this idea of work and this will to will. How do you see that fitting into this idea of idleness? Do you find that to be a false idea, or do you think that's actually our true path?
No, this is what Bertrand Russell argues for in his essay In Praise of Idleness. This is 100 years old now, and he says, he points to everything. So this is 100 years ago, and he says, okay, everything that's wrong is the following: everything's mass entertainment. Nothing is done for itself. No one's writing a book just for writing a book. No one's studying for the sake of studying. There's no art for the sake of art. Yada yada. So he points to everything that we're still talking about now, and then he says, but the great solution will be, and there's theory of salvation. Once we have full technique, he says in the old English way, there, we will have basically what people now call fully automated luxury communism, which then, by the way, is taken up by Herbert Marcuse too. And by Silicon Valley, obviously, right? Because Silicon Valley is basically just a weird amalgamation of the Frankfurt School, Marcuse, and Heidegger. That's their philosophy. But what this reveals, what Russell reveals, is exactly this, right? We have not yet met all needs. And there's an interesting essay by Keynes, who was in the same circles, the Cambridge boys, as Russell, where he says, around the same time, we will now have to use usury and greed for 100 years so that our offspring in 2020 around will have enough substance to live off for the rest of eternity. It's the same idea. But these ideas are, these notions are very old. These notions, this is why I point out very briefly and much longer in some other essays, that Plato points out the difference between Atlantis and Athens. Atlantis sinks because they begin to focus on lack, on meeting all their needs. And I'm not saying that human beings don't have needs, right? We do. It's bodily needs. We need to eat, we need to sleep, we need sex, we need all kinds of needs met, yes. But these are immediate needs. And the trouble is with our systems, so-called, that we have, is all we focus on are these immediate needs, within which the human being is ever only reduced to, as we're voters and consumers. That's who we are. But we're not allowed, and language is communication, etc. But for someone like Hegel, it would still be true, and Nietzsche especially, that the human being is an artist first, that language is poetry first. So it's not that we can reach idleness, or leisure in this true sense of schola, is not something that you can reach once everything has been met. But no, it's actually, you arrive at it. And as you arrive at this way of thinking, which is the classical way of being, which means that life is plenty. Being is in excess of itself. It gifts itself. And then by having, this is where meaning arises. That's when meaning arises, etc. Meaning arises from out of this way of thinking. And then everything else flows from that. So it's thinking first. We're on the earth, to speak with Hegel, not just to do and act, but we're on the earth to grasp and understand and reason. And that's what we have to do first. And then that's what then a certain fullness comes from. But if it's about trying to reach a state where everything's met, I mean, show me the possibility of that, because when you start putting up conditions of, we need this condition in place and this condition in place, then you get the most unleisurely way of being, because actually what you have is a tyranny of conditions and have to be met.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't help shake the fact that this forgetting seems to be pervasive on so many levels, that I'm just curious as to how are you approaching this forgetting and trying to bring more people into this way of being in your own practices, or with your Thinkers Guild.
It's very, on some level it's very simple, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's because the question is a very simple question. So it now says that my internet connection is unstable. So if I just let me know if it breaks down.
Okay.
If that even works then. So I'm not sure whether what I'm doing or saying it, has any bearing. But what I can say perhaps in general is that what Heidegger says when he speaks of the oblivion of being, you can translate this as saying forgetting the old ways. Mm-hmm. So it's quite a simple thought, right? Toti en enai, that which was being. Being is just a different name for the old. Mm-hmm. And to make this even more like a slogan, as you know, what we are always after is the new. The new formula of the dishwashing tablets, and that's supposed to give us meaning. The new, the better, the higher, the more superlative, the bigger, the better, but it can't be met, right? When you begin to diagnose that what's always lurking behind this is the fear not to be completely competing with this, right? Like, this is why I don't like this notion of, for example, the marketplace of ideas. Ideas don't compete, right? There's no competition in thought. Because truth is unitary and we participate in it. Mm-hmm. So the way that this, I think, what this is now, this current situation, is to a certain degree an opening, right? Mm-hmm. And then you can point to certain one of the responses that we saw with It's Time to Build, with this essay, is that what's supposed to happen is to have just more material needs met. But Andrew pointed this out, Andrew Taggart and I too, is we need to contemplate first. How did we get to where we are? And these are such simple questions. For example, I mean, even just in terms of, what does it mean that we say that we live in the Anthropocene? Or before that, it was called the nuclear age, the nuclear epoch. Where does this come from? Why is it possible, for example, to set parameters and conditions so that we can fly? These are very abstract questions already. But for us, I think in a more immediate sense, the question of being and meaning obviously shows itself to be very important, right? People ask, it seems more and more, the question of meaning. And that's where you can see an opening, but then of course, philosophy has the trouble is that there isn't a single answer. But what this is, and even just the quest for meaning, is already a beginning of remembering. Mm-hmm. And it's a remembering of literally you, as Plato says, anamnesis of the soul. The soul begins to remember the ideas, the forms of the good, the forms of truth, and the form of everything that is. Mm-hmm. And the operations of the will is something you realize when you speak to people who work a lot. So I have a bit of a philosophical practice, so I talk to people, and some of them tell me I have no memory of my 10 years as a lawyer, because they never take the time to slow down and think and reflect. And if you look at this then on a macro scale, if you like, that's where we are. We never take the time to reflect and think back on who we are. And this is why this forgetting sets in. And that, of course, accelerates further, etc. But right now, even the Queen of England has said this is a time to slow down. So perhaps and it's very fascinating to see all of a sudden political leaders like the Queen, or today even Chancellor Angela Merkel in Germany, saying, right now we have to cherish the old people in that regard, and that's who are with us and who are now lonely in their homes because they can't be visited because they've built this country. And it's as simple as it can be, as simple as that. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to go into the most pressing philosophical questions, but it can just be, how can I say I? What is it that lets me say that I am? And that's when this philosophical thinking perhaps then sets in. But you need this sense of leisure first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Paul, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you, Johannes. This is, I thought your reading was incredible. So 2 questions. One is, are you going to be posting that, what you wrote? Because I'd love to read it again. And 2, one of my questions is just around what can we learn from Eastern cultures and the spirit of non-doing. I've spent the last 2 years in Asia, and I found it easier to kind of experiment with different modes of being there in a way that I can't really explain, but it just is. And I'm wondering if you've experienced anything like that, what kind of wisdom you think we can extract from those cultures, and just any thoughts on it.
Yeah, thank you. I will publish it, and good to finally meet you all a bit more in person, not just on Twitter. So I'll post it, and I'll link you to it. So thanks for reminding me, because I usually don't publish this, but I should start doing this. In terms of, I will speak. I've not lived in Asia, so I don't have any personal experiences. But what I see, for example, with someone like a philosopher like Heidegger, who is 20th century is a century where these worlds inevitably began to meet, and it's still occurring. And we have to be, I think one has to be strict to some degree, that we are, there is a difference. And it's by appreciating that difference, though, that a genuine dialogue can set in. That's I think that would be the sort of that's important to bear in mind. And what you can, I think, what one can see in terms of this radical fundamental difference is that what we call the sciences, the hard sciences, that's Western, that's European, that's Western. And what it wants is something else entirely, that what you could see with Taoism or Buddhism, which is it wants control. Buddhism does not want control over beings in their totality. And that's something that has begun to set in early modern times in Europe with Francis Bacon and René Descartes, for example. That's basically where you can say where this begins. And where we also, where then we could perhaps say, it's fair to say that this is also where we begin to forget what it means to be human, because we become a thinking thing, or as Descartes says, or we become pure machines, as Thomas Hobbes says, or just machines. And we're also becoming more and more divided from nature and from the earth. But don't forget that for Descartes, animals are basically machines. And that's very much at the heart of our being now, is that animals are machines. Plants are even lesser machines. For Hobbes, all we are is the state is a machine even. Everything is machinery. And what one can learn, I think, and learning means not knowing at first, and also means a certain distance. So I think from the distance between this way of being and the other ways of being, that's where maybe this sensation that you had of other modes of being become possible began to arise, because it's in a certain foreignness that one comes into one's own. It also finds, though, other dimensions within oneself, right? Because I know your journey a bit, I'm reading your blog and everything, and leaving this path of total work behind and finding meaning outside of this, what we call it, the rat race, and Nietzsche calls it literally an uncanny wheelwork, unheimliches Räderwerk, in which we are trapped. And this is almost 140 years ago. But it is, I think, in accepting this foreignness, that we can see other ways of being. Yes, very much so. And it's very much, I guess, for now, a time to come to our own senses, and at the same time to invite this dialogue with other ways of being. Because to double down now on more stuff will not save us. It will and that's what you can see with the stock market. It's money thrown at it, and it's actually creating more of a lack, because it's creating more debt. And by creating more debt, we will be in we will be we're actually gambling away our future by creating more debt. That's literally what it is. It's a bet on the future, and it creates a negative relationship to the future already. So it's binding you towards something that's supposed to come, and it's full of effort. I think the sometimes perhaps the lightness of the Far Eastern way of being, but it's there's so much to explore there too, just in terms of their language, right? The fact that Tao means path and truth and compass of being is, for me, that's where it's at. We have to, I think, maybe one breadcrumb to leave. I think we have to understand the difference and similarities between Logos and the Tao. I'll leave it at that.
Interesting. I think that it would be interesting to hear what your perspective is, and with what I'm noticing, and I guess maybe I have an eye for Heidegger, but it seems like more people are talking about Heidegger right now, and kind of going back to his fundamental questions about being, dwelling, thinking, And
Death.
what do you think about, yeah, death. And what do you think about, I mean, Heidegger coming up in conversation and what Heidegger has to give in this present moment?
Well, what his thinking has to give is what it's always had to give, which is remembering the fundamental question. And that's I think now it's weird, right? Now it's less abstract. I said in a conversation with Guy Sengstock a couple of weeks ago or a month ago now, that it's uncanny that philosophy all of a sudden is no longer untimely. We've now entered a sphere where it'll probably be a brief moment, right? Where people actually listen and are open to an inbreathing of these questions, but also because, as I said in the talk, right, the operations of the will to will have stopped, and because I think what the fuel of this is, and I've said this in other talks, the fuel of it is boredom, which then needs to be entertained, distracted from, and of course also meaninglessness. If your life is meaningless, you consume, you fill this is what people describe who have addictions to consumption, is that they are filling a void, a lack. What Heidegger is telling us is, what he saw is that we don't make ourselves, is that we are not in charge. Subjectivity fools itself, or the human subject fools itself to assuming that we're fully in control and controlling the world. What Heidegger says, no, we're not. We're functionaries of techniques, he says. And his entire philosophy, and that's what my book is about in Heidegger, is a memento mori. Remember that you are mortal. Remember that you are a finite being that is not in charge, but at the same time playing with forces and powers this being has never summoned before. And this is why perhaps Heidegger is now coming back up. But what are your thoughts, Raven? Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, the kind of uncanny thing about this event is that we are confined to our homes, which brings us into dwelling. And dwelling brings us opens up the possibility of bringing us into being, and into maybe even the contemplation of more mortality. And it's this kind of massive coordination of the whole human population that provides this opening for a new way, or an old way of rediscovering or remembering of this other way of being, which is very human, and an escape, I think, from the machinic metaphor of existence, which we've just been doing and just operating within. And now we are coming back into relationship with the earth, the kind of biological, and I find that Heidegger was just right on in terms of really providing. And I wonder about the German language as well, because so much of your work, I find, is acting as translator for English speakers, because the German words have so many dimensions to them that in English become flattened. And so much of Heidegger's thinking seems to be dimensional, spatial, oriented in landscape. So
here's the difference between English and German, between the two vernaculars. The German language is spatio-temporal and verbal. So this means that we very easily smash together words, yes, but we also very easily, you get to this joke of haha, very long German words, maybe you've heard that. But also we can take the word stellen, which means to place or to position. Now I can say herstellen, and that means to produce. And then I can say vorstellen, and that means to imagine, to represent, but also to introduce. And all I do is add a prefix to it, and it becomes spatio-temporal, because the prefix indicates a certain direction, and the direction is always spatio-temporal. The English language is different. The English language finds it very difficult to turn a verb into a noun, and the English language is ultimately descriptive. This is why it also just in pure quantitative terms, the English language has more words. It just has a lot more words to describe things, objects. Right? You can just say a lot of beautiful adjectives about something. The German language is very different, which is why very rarely it translates. And then also what the English language lacks entirely is self-reflective verbs. So verbs that necessarily reflect or come back to themselves, which is why so much is often lost. And then by a series of accidents and contingencies, I've ended up speaking both languages well enough to perhaps be this transmitter in between. But in terms of Heidegger has this word of Ereignis, and people have translated this as event. But Ereignis means, he says, that which comes into its own as it withdraws. Mm-hmm. So right now we're in a moment of utter withdrawal. But at the same time, and this also comes back to the question from Paul, and this withdrawal, we're coming back into our own. And then here we are, to complement my answer from before, in the dialogue with Buddhism, for example, because Buddhism is a thinking of withdrawing, is a thinking of non-availability. And that's where we need to get to in the West, is to think, understand, and appreciate concealment, non-availability, withdrawal, because what we want is total availability and access and control over it. And that's disappeared. All right, and now we're in this abeyance, but we don't yet know what's going to. We can't even make. Usually you make plans, right? I'm going to be at a wedding in 2 months, and I'm going to be traveling to Italy in 2 years. You don't even know where when I'll be able to fly back to Germany. So yeah, all the planning is out the window. Mm-hmm. It's literally day to day now, and yeah. So.
Yeah, sense of future has fundamentally changed.
Yes.
Yes. Andrew, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Hi, Johannes. Great presentation. I've been following some of your content on YouTube, which is great as well. So I just wanted to ask, do you think this idea of being conflicts with our evolutionary drive for status and our drive for to move up the social hierarchy? Because I think at our core, humans are status-seeking animals, and I see this potential conflict between our sort of evolutionary drives and this idea to, adopt an idea of being in the present moment or whatnot.
Okay, what do you mean by being?
I guess perhaps Heidegger's notion of being. Yeah.
Which is what?
Personally, I haven't read Heidegger, but I guess sort of what you were getting at in the lecture. Let's say, I think he uses the word Dasein.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Dasein is the being of the human being, and that's a regular German word. It's the openness to the there of being. But you see, when you ask the question, what the question does is it posits that there's the evolutionary drive for status. That's not questioned. But so what one has to do in a philosophical question is first to question the question, right? Is it true, fundamentally true, that all we do is social hierarchy or status? Is this all that human beings do? Is this true for all human beings across all civilizations? Is this true for what we Aboriginal societies? Is that the case? Or is this only the case for perhaps competitive capitalist societies in which that kind of status seeking is rewarded? And is this perhaps not the case even for a country up until this day like Italy, or Spain or Japan, where people don't think in terms of jobs, but in terms of roles that they take in their community, right? I have a certain role to fulfill, and then the question of being has to do with the question of meaning. That's what it ultimately is, and so you could have even within this framework, the drive for status, which human beings have to some degree, but not only. I don't think that that's the only thing that's driving history. Even that can reveal something about meaning and what it means to be human, but that's not the only dimension we're in, right? Because there are more moments, I would think, that might not be recorded in history, where human beings do something not at all to find status or social hierarchy. Right? Caring for the elderly is not highly status rewarding, and still people do it. And luckily they do it, because if not, everything would break down. And actually, societies that don't do this, they break down, right? This is North America in a nutshell. Is just, give me my money and my career, and I will not care for the elderly. I don't think that that's a very sustainable society anyways. Yeah.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, and finally, Johannes, I just wanted to ask you about how you're addressing the failure of or the capture of our academic institutions, or the places of where thinking ought to dwell in your own. I know that's a big subject to get into.
The University of Manchester is we're losing 250 million pounds this year, so we're going to fire people. That was their response just today. So yeah, please go on. Sorry.
Oh, and I just saw in the chat that Andre has a question. So I'm gonna let Andre ask that question here, and probably be the final one. So Andre, please.
No, but you wanted to ask. Okay, yeah, Andre, yeah. And then.
I know that's a hot topic.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So this is probably a bit of a semantic question. Idleness, I would probably define as a negation of something. So to be idle is to not do something.
Yeah.
And would there be a delineation between having passive idleness and active idleness? Because would not one be just the lack of your being to enact on something, passive idleness? So it's your being is not acting on anything, it's just being itself. Whereas an active idleness, you're using part of your Dasein, so to speak, or one part of your being to actively not do something.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll try and answer this. I think, first of all, I would think that's a fair description of it. And of course, idleness has these negative connotations in the English vernacular for the most part now. But so this is why I've used the word, I've said skole very often, or the true spirit of leisure, which is only just an approximation also of what the Greeks mean by skole. But I think idleness, to make this a bit clearer, and this comes back to what Paul said too, and to what you say also, is that it's, the idle stands first. To be idle means to move away from the immediate demands from, for example, the will to will, right? And by moving away from these immediate demands, by denying them their power, in this idle stance, we then perhaps come into the meditative mode, if you like, in which then meaning arises that is completely divided from the question of usefulness and utility. Yeah?
Yeah.
So just as an addendum to your question.
Okay.
Yeah, you should read, you will find a PDF of Pieper's book online, Leisure as the Basis of Culture, Joseph Pieper.
Find that and read it.
Yeah, it's a definitely recommend it. It's a short and much more accessible than you'd expect.
Yeah, it's a very good essay in that regard. Raven, what was your question on
institutions? Yeah,
I
I
have
mean,
another 2 hours, as Paul said, but no, I'm not going to take you 2 hours.
I know. We could probably talk. I mean, there's just so much in this, the whole range of
Yeah.
ideas that you're getting into right now, and these like fundamental questions. And there's so many just mirages of thought to shatter and to try and subvert so many levels of it. And yeah, so in the case of institutions, I just see that you're attempting to experiment with different models. I mean, your Thinkers Guild, I think, is a great example of trying to create something outside of academic institutions where people can actually engage in the process of dialogue and thinking about the classical engagement with ideas and with being without being subject to abstraction and like categorization and ranking based on their performance within that realm. So if you just have a few things you would like to say about that right here in the last few minutes.
You mentioned something I would have forgotten, which is rankings. Rankings is exactly this kind of making everything useful. A wonderful essay, and people can email me and I'll send it to them. I'm not finding it now, of course. It's written by Ivo De Cinato, which is entitled The Fiction of Peer Review. So even peer review, which is, it's no longer a peer. Who is a peer? A peer is, you and Peter, you're very likely peers in the Stoa. You are co-hosting the Stoa as peers, and you are inviting me on and to give a talk, and others too, and they become your peers in the process, which means that there is the possibility to, in a trusting relationship, to disagree. That's important. That's what academia needs. That's what academia ultimately means philosophy. That's what thinking needs, right? It can't just be these self-serving circles, which of course we have because we need citation rings in order to be ranked highly. And it functions as gatekeeping, so we can talk about that. But then of course you also have this very sick slogan of publish or perish. So if you don't publish, you perish. That's the opposite of the idle observer. The philosophical life is the highest form of theoria, as Aristotle says, which means to observe the world. If the philosopher has to produce papers, he's no longer a philosopher. The philosopher that produces papers is some sort of it's a journalist or something. And the peer, so everything's perverted, right? It uses these words that are very meaningful and profound and wonderful, but it perverts them. The peer is, and also everything's full of pressure. Everything is a burden, right? Teaching is described by academics as a burden. Oh, I have to teach again. And when it's week 9 here in the UK, many will say, oh, week 9, because it's just one more week of teaching. And then finally my teaching load, right? Teaching load. All these words are so ridiculous. Teaching is not a load, right? If you are a teacher, then you read and then you write and then you teach. And after teaching, so I got some, not feedback. I refuse now to use cybernetic language. I've gotten now responses and more questions. So I will go back afterwards and rewrite the essay, and then I will publish it to get, again, responses to it. And that's the wholeness of teaching. And I've never found it possible, unfortunately, within academic circle, also because they don't like eccentric types are now forbidden, right? So that makes it a bit difficult for me. And when I tried to publish my book on Heidegger with Springer, which I think they will now publish, they made it, the reviewers who I've never met, one of them was okay, and the other one was just violent. The violence was, he did not mention this author and not this author and not this book and not this book. That was the entire review. Of course I haven't mentioned everyone and everything that you think is, where this is not a peer review. And the violence comes in because it is anonymous. And this anonymity is, that's where, that's actually where the entire idea of the academy breaks down. The academy of the original academy, the academy of Plato, existed for hundreds of years, and they all disagreed with him. So it's not about, here's the dogma, you read it, and take my word for it. No, it is in this profound peer-based disagreement, which only can happen when you actually trust someone, but not in these violent operations of trying to gatekeep certain ways of thinking. Or so you brought up the question of language between Heidegger and the German vernacular and the English. There's certain ways of thinking about Heidegger that are verboten in English academic circles, because they would be closer to the German, and you can't think like this. But actually, if you begin to think of the history of being not as a history, but as the tidings of being, and right now we live through an ebbing away of being, it begins to make more sense. And you were a student on the Heidegger Deleuze course, and McCoy, that artist from New York, recently sent me a tweet saying, understanding Gestell as the concentration of positioning makes such a big difference. Because you begin to see it very differently. And when you think of it as in framing, it's like something coming from the outside but kind of like overpowering. But no, it's actually much worse, right? It's much more subtle. It's in how things appear and are. And with the guild, it's basically just, the guilds were what built the first universities. So I don't know where this is going to lead, of course, but as a guild, it just brings together people. So for example, we're doing a book publication next week. Sean Burke's an artist from Pasadena. He's written a book, Winter and Summer, remembering who we are is basically the subtitle. And Aesthetics of Memory, I think, is the subtitle. That'll be out next week. So we'll do book publications and courses, and we'll see where it leads. It's just bringing a couple of eccentric types together, and then those eccentric types, they can maybe build the next university. Because what we're seeing now is if they fire that many people, it's just in pure market terms, it's pure market logic, that's how you destroy a brand. And so for the coming decades, I think that private or cooperative education, then that'll thrive because people are open to it. This is why the Stoa is so fascinating, because people are coming to these talks that maybe wouldn't have come half a year ago.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I'm going to tell us a little bit about the day and what other events will be happening at the Stoa here. And thank you, Johannes, for joining us. I feel like what you're bringing voice to in this space is very, very important, and there's a lot to talk about. So I really appreciate that. And let me tell you about upcoming events here. So we have Human Systems live action redesign with Anne-Lorraine Selk at 12 noon today.
I'm just going to jump in. That's canceled, that one.
Oh, that one's canceled.
Yeah.
Great. Okay.
And then the Existential Dance Party is canceled as well.
Okay, so we have Samo, right?
Yes, Samo, that's the only one.
Okay, so reform of government institution. I think that dovetails very well with the conversation we're having about the academy right now. So that's going to be later at 4 p.m. Eastern time. So if you would like to join us for that, you can RSVP at thestoa.ca. And there are also many more events coming on the horizon. So thank you all for being here. And I just wanted to propose an idea. So Peter and I are working on this idea of bringing people in to have a conversation and then opening it up more to a seminar dialogue. And I was just going to see, Johannes, if you have 15 minutes or something where you just wanted to kind of open up to a conversation after this. Totally up to you. But I thought I would make the invitation.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, great. Let's do it.